All right, now for the supply side of the market. So this is the other side of the coin here. There's a lot of similarities. So it's once you've got demand under your belt, this seems a little bit easier. But again, we look at how much firms are willing and able to provide at various prices. So again, you have to be willing and able to provide it. Sometimes even if the prices are high, they want to provide it, but they can't because they can't get something they need in order to supply it. And again, this is really driven by their profit. The more profit they can make, the more resources they're willing to devote to supplying the product. So we have a similar thing here where we have the schedule, which is a chart, and the curve, which is plotting each of these points and connecting the dots. So the same thing on a graph. But what we see here is that as the price goes up, the quantity that these firms are willing and able to supply goes up. We see, instead of an inverse relationship, we see a positive relationship between these numbers. The higher the price goes, again, farther away from zero, the higher the quantity supplied goes, again, going farther away from zero. So the higher the price, in general, the higher the price, the more profit they can make, and so they are willing to supply more. They will devote resources away from other things in order to produce these because there's a profit to be had there. So they're going to shift their resources to where they can make the most profit, and most of the time higher prices mean higher profits. So we see a positive relationship here. The quantity supplied is defined as the amount, the amount that firms are willing and able to produce at a specific price. Okay? Again, the quantity supplied is linked to a specific price, just like the quantity demanded was linked to a specific price. The law of supply, again, there's the official definition in your book, but mostly what we see here is as the price of a product goes up, the quantity supplied, the amount that firms are willing and able to supply, goes up as well. And as the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. If they can't make a profit at it, they're not going to produce it. And the lower the profit, the less resources they're willing to supply here to produce that. Again, just like demand, we can see shifts in the curve against something other than price. So price would just move me to a different point on that same supply curve, but there are things that will shift the whole curve. So if we look at an increase in supply is a shift to the right, just like it was before. An increase in supply, that's this one, says that at every price point we have a higher quantity supplied. We're moving out to the right to a higher quantity. We're moving away from zero. So at every price, the amount that they are willing to supply goes up. So you could plot like this point to this point, this point to this point. Oh, that's really probably not that helpful. But if we're following the quantity along the x-axis, and that's it's getting higher, it's getting farther away from zero as we shift to the right. It's not going down, it's going to the right, all right? And that's why it's important not to think up and down, but think left and right. And then we see the same thing here to the left. Oops. There we go. To the left is a decrease in supply. That's this one. That's going over here. And what we see then is at every price point we have a lower quantity supplied. We're getting closer to zero. So along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis, we are shifting to the left. We're getting closer to zero. So that is a decrease in supply. So for both supply and demand, a shift to the right is an increase, a shift to the left is a decrease, which is why you want to make sure it's not going up, it's going in, it's going to the left. Okay, so that's the important part that you want to look at there so you don't get confused. Also, again, so we see the same thing here. If we started out here at a price of 300 and we were willing to supply 300. If the supply curve shifted to the right, all right, we shift out to the right, at the price of 300, I'm now willing to supply 500. So the quantity supplied increased even though the price didn't change. So the shifting of the curve is at every possible price point. We have a higher quantity supplied, or if it's a decrease, a lower quantity supplied. So what causes these shifts? The number one thing is the price of inputs. Okay, so the price of inputs, these are the costs to a business. And remember, we said that the revenue, which is based on the price, minus the cost equals the profit. So if the revenue stays the same, they're charging the same price, but their costs go up. So if costs are going up, that means their profit is going down. And so they're not making as much profit, they're not going to be willing to supply as much. But on the same hand, if their costs are going down, that means their profits are going up, and so they would be willing to supply more. So, so if input costs are going up, then the supply will shift to, the supply will decrease. It will shift to the left because they're not going to be able to make as much money. But if the costs are going down, that means more profit. That means supply will shift to the right and it will go up because they can make more money at every price point there. The second thing we see, which is kind of related, is technological change. This will almost always increase supply. So because again, if we talk about technology, that usually reduces their production costs. So it means they're either able to make more or they're able to make the same amount at a lower cost. That's almost always what technology means. So either way, that translates to more profit, and so we would see the supply shift up. Sometimes we do see a technological change that could decrease supply. So a few years back in Hurricane Katrina, all the oil refineries were wiped out, so their technology was gone and they were not then able to produce as much as they wanted to. So sometimes you have that. If you think about that, like I guess it was a couple years ago, and Antietam cable went out like for, I don't know, 2 weeks or something in the summer. It was out for a really long time. And not only homes were relying on that for their internet, but a lot of firms were as well. And so firms couldn't access, their records. They really couldn't do business. And so the technology was taken away, and so you saw this, people just couldn't produce what they wanted to, whether it was a service or whatever, they couldn't do it. And so supply went down because of that technological change. So occasionally you have that, but most of the time technology is an advancement which will lower cost or increase production capabilities, and so that will increase supply. Number 3 means price of substitutes in production. It sort of means whatever else you could be doing, all right? So let's say I am a farmer, and I'm a farmer and I'm growing wheat. If I wasn't growing wheat, I could be growing soybeans, okay? So if the price of the alternate, if the price of soybeans goes up, that means I could probably be making more profit growing soybeans than wheat, and so therefore the supply of wheat will go down because I'll switch over to something I could be making more. So if the price of something else, if the price of an alternate goes up, the supply of the first thing will go down as people switch over to the alternate. They could be making more money growing soybeans, so the supply of wheat will go down as people switch over there. Number 4 is the number of firms in the market. That works just like population. If there's more firms producing this, then supply is going to go up. If there's less firms, supply will go down. And the expected future prices, we saw that one in demand as well, but now it works the opposite. So now if I'm a firm and I think the future price will go up, I will decrease the supply now because I want to hold off and sell it once that price goes up. If I think the future price is going to go down, I will increase the amount I'm willing to sell now because I want to sell it at the higher price before the price goes down. So the same thing, but you know, if we all expect the price to go up in the future, the demand will go up, but the supply will go down at the same time because everybody's trying to kind of maximize their own profit there. This next one, this is also very similar to what we saw in demand. It's really kind of the same thing here. So we'll put big stars here so we know this is important. Change in supply versus a change in the quantity supplied. So a change in the quantity supplied, again, when we see quantity supplied, that means at a specific price. And so the price went from 400 to 450. So we shift from A to B here, okay? So that is caused by change in price. That is a movement along the same curve. Curve. So I'm going from A to B. That's this one. A change in supply is when the whole curve shifts. In this case, we're going from supply to 1 to 2, so that's an increase in supply. The whole curve shifts. This is at every price, okay? So at all prices. And this is caused by a change in one of the 5 determinants of supply that we just talked about. So at every price point we shift over here, and so this is a move from B to C. Okay? So it's very similar to the way it worked in demand. Now, let's put the two together, okay? So here's my supply and here's my demand. Demand is the downward facing one, and then supply we saw has a positive relationship, so that one goes up. So where the two meet here, X marks the spot, right? So where the two cross, we arrive at a price of 350 and a quantity of 5. That is the equilibrium point. So the point where the two meet is the equilibrium point. That determines the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. That is the point at which the amount that people are willing and able to purchase equals the amount that firms are willing to supply at a specific price point. That's what equilibrium is. And so the market will settle there. What if when, so the market will pretty much always naturally, if we don't interfere with it, the market will always naturally find its way to this equilibrium spot. If, for example, so we saw in the last one the equilibrium point was 350. Well, what if Apple guessed wrong and they priced them at 400 first, okay? So if we follow 400, we follow that over here, we're going to intersect the demand curve first. So we follow that down, and the quantity demanded would be 4. But we would keep on going till we intersect the supply curve, and so we follow that down, and the quantity supplied was 6. So at a price of 400, the firm produced 6 million watches, but they only sold 4 million. So they've got a surplus of 2 million watches. So they produced 2 million more watches than they sold. What are they going to do? Naturally, the thing they're going to do, they've already spent the money on them, they want to sell them, so they drop the price. So let's say they drop it to $375. So then we go over here, and so the quantity demanded goes up a little bit. Let's say it's 4.5. And then the quantity supplied would be here at 5.5. So there's still a surplus, but it's a smaller surplus, so they drop the price again until we get to here. Now here they've sold the amount of watches they're making, so there's no incentive to drop the price any farther, and that's how the market settles at equilibrium. If they priced it too low, if they priced it at 250, they follow here, they only made 3 million at that, because we intersect the supply curve first. So this is the quantity supplied, but then we go over, and when we hit the demand curve and go down, follow that, here's the quantity demanded is 7, so we have a shortage of 4 million watches. We only produce 3 million, but 7 million people want them, and so people are scrambling to get it. So firms would raise the price and then raise it a little bit more and raise a little bit more until we hit the equilibrium point, until there's no shortage anymore. So if the price is below equilibrium, you're going to have a shortage. If the price is above equilibrium, you're going to have a surplus, and firms will adjust the prices until the shortage of the surplus is gone, and so it will kind of naturally find its way back to that equilibrium point. And an important thing to remember is that the supply and demand both count equally important. Price is determined by the interaction of the buyers and the sellers, and neither group, as long as there's competition in the market, which our market has, neither group can kind of dictate if it is. So if we go back to this one and people are like, I won't pay $250. Well, the firms are not going to supply that many because they can't make a profit at that. And the same thing over here, if they want to say, I'm just charging $400 and I'm not going to pay any less than that, then they're not going to sell as many because people aren't going to, they would rather sell $5 million at $350 than $4 million at $400. So they're going to do what's in their best interest, but they can't force people to pay more than they're willing, and you can't force businesses to produce it at a point where they're going to lose money. So it's the interaction of the two. However, once it hits equilibrium, they found this equilibrium, things can still shift, and that's when we see the change in a price of a good.